This video is about the fire at Windsor Castle on the 20th of November 1992. We've made it for two reasons. First is to preserve a record of a historic moment, a savage attack by fire on one of the jewels of our national heritage. And second is to offer an examination of the incident from the firefighter's point of view, a record of how the Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service dealt with the incident, including the supervision and coordination of assistance of over-the-border fire services and other agencies. Perhaps our experience may be of use to others.
The Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service has its headquarters in Reading. Here, the control room, staffed by 4 watches of 4 staff, coordinates the fire and rescue control for the whole of the county. Covering 20 fire stations, half of them manned by whole-time shift, the other 10 by retained staff. The stations share a total of 24 pumps, 2 hydraulic platforms and a range of specialist appliances. The town of Windsor is in the east of the county of Berkshire, just west of London and south of the M4 motorway. Windsor Castle, Her Majesty the Queen's principal weekend residence, is set on high ground overlooking the River Thames, in an estate that covers 5.26 hectares. Although the number increases when the Queen is in residence, the regular castle community is made up of about 350 people. There are over 1,000 rooms here, many open to visitors, who can number up to 10,000 at the height of the tourist season. First built in the 11th century, the castle has seen many additions and modifications. The walls of stone and brick are up to 4 metres thick. The floors are stone, concrete or timber, and the roofing is timber with sometimes slate but more usually lead covering, several inches thick in places. Because of the many structural alterations during its 900-year lifespan, the castle is pierced by voids, some of them up to 2.5 metres wide. The castle has its own brigade, operating round the clock to maintain its firefighting equipment and respond to incidents of fire within the castle and its grounds. There are a small number of trained whole-time firefighters, plus a further number of part-time personnel on pager alert from the castle staff. Also on call is a salvage team of 25 castle staff. Somewhat ironically, at the time of the fire, the castle was undergoing a major refurbishment of the upper ward, especially in terms of rewiring and the installation of automatic fire detection. The known problem of the voids was being tackled with as much compartmentation as practicable by way of cavity barriers. Because of this work, the magnificent 56-metre-long St George's Hall had been cleared of all major works of art and furniture. The private chapel adjoining the hall, linked to it by the double-sided organ, was being used as a temporary work area for experts to view the pictures before packing them and removing them for restoration. It was here that the fire started. We'll come back to the most likely cause of the fire when we look at the work of the fire investigation team. For the moment, having given you an idea of the background to the incident, we want to move on to the actions taken as soon as staff in the area noticed that the curtains screening the altar had caught fire, and that the fire was quickly spreading to the roof and floor of the private chapel.
Fire station Windsor Castle. What chapel? Whereabouts? In the private chapel Windsor Castle.
As soon as the castle watchroom was informed, the officer on duty immediately mobilised the castle brigade by radio. Then, at 11:36 AM, telephoned the Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service.
Fire and Rescue.
There's Windsor Castle here.
Yeah.
We've got a fire in the private chapel at Windsor Castle.
The private chapel.
In the private chapel. Come to the quadrangle as arranged.
Just a moment. Now, is this a fire alarm or an actual fire?
It's a fire being reported.
Fire in private chapel. And you wish us to attend the quadrangle? The quadrangle, is that?
We've got a fire in the private chapel at Windsor Castle, okay?
Right, rendezvous at the quadrangle.
Sorry?
We're to rendezvous at the quadrangle.
Yeah, come to the advance gate as arranged.
Righto.
Yep.
Right.
The brigade's strategic plans had been well rehearsed, and the predetermined attendance was immediately mobilised. This consisted of 2 water tender ladders, 1 water tender, 1 hydraulic platform and 1 salvage pump. The first crew into the private chapel, the castle's own brigade, reported that the fire was well alight with the load-bearing timber gallery at the point of collapse and was spreading rapidly, especially at higher levels. An amateur video captured the arrival of the first fire appliance within 8 minutes of the call. The newly arrived officer in charge immediately called for further assistance.
Charlie 171, go ahead, over.
Steve from Sub-Officer Koza, mate pump 10, over.
The third appliance to arrive was set up as the control point, using the major incident command and control pack carried by all Berkshire pumping appliances. As the fire continued its rapid spread, the calls for assistance likewise continued.
HD, Charlie 131, priority, over.
Charlie 131, go ahead, over.
HD from Station Officer Warner, make pumps 1515. Make HP 2, over.
Just after noon, requests for further assistance were made.
HD, Charlie 131, over. 2 VA support teams required. Cylinder support team required. And CIU, over.
At 12:12, the operations commander took over from the divisional officers, and within a couple of minutes, a first call from Charlie 191 was heard.
We're calling with priority, go ahead, over.
HD, Delta 191 from SCO Ashfield. Make pumps 20. 10, 10 officers required. Over.
London Hillingdon pump, can you attend make pumps 25? Windsor Castle, over.
The requests for further assistance continued for the next 2 hours. Make 35 from the Deputy County Fire Officer, by then the Instant Commander, was timed at 14:29.
HD, Charlie 191, priority, over.
Charlie 191, pass your priority, over.
HD from DCFO Harper at special address 1. Make pump 35, 35, and officers from Berkshire 1515. Over.
Back at headquarters, the pre-planned major incident room was set up to work alongside the control room, handling the less urgent tasks, and allowed the control room to keep track of all the appliances being directed to the blaze by its computer-aided mobilising system. In all, the following number of resources was utilised, mobilised from 9 brigades either initially or later as relief. 36 pumps, 7 specialist units, 200 personnel, 25 officers, 31 jets and 3 monitors. The biggest problem, of course, the main reason that the fire spread so fast and so furiously, were the voids. If we look at a plan of the first floor of the castle, from where the fire started, on the curtains in the private chapel, as well as the spread along the floor, burning both the carpet and the picture restorer's packaging materials, the most significant route for fire development was upwards and along the higher levels. The lath and plaster of the alcove wouldn't have offered much resistance. The roof void above the alcove was shared by St George's Hall. The fire would have spread quickly through the 56 metres void, into the tower, over the vestry and subsequently into the Brunswick Tower. The ceiling of the hall was vented to let air into the void, but the vents were in fact obscured by the decorative fixed shields. As the fire raged through the void, the vents would have eventually allowed flames to pass back down into the hall. Stained glass windows behind the altar would have offered little defence against the fire spreading into the corridor behind the chapel and from there into the upper kitchen area. and more glazed panelling would have allowed immediate fire spread into the crimson drawing room. But there can be little doubt that the fire spread so quickly and devastatingly because of the many voids behind panelling and the many ceiling cavities, some of which had been opened by the electricians at work on rewiring. The rapid passage of fire through these upper-level voids was to determine the firefighting strategy. To the incident commander's team, it was clear that to put all their resources to fighting the heart of the fire would be pointless, as the blaze was travelling rapidly under the floors, along the wall cavities and over their heads through those voids that were difficult to access and were causing frequent collapses. To begin with, there were 6 jets strategically positioned on the first floor. At the height of the blaze, 10. It was decided to get firefighting jets into position and concentrate on a holding operation, creating fire breaks at the Clock Tower and Chester Tower, Waterloo Chamber, Throne Room and Grand Reception Room to contain the fire within a controllable area. From 1 jet on the ground floor to 15. On the second floor, 9 jets. Many jets, like one on the gallery at the end of St George's Hall, had to be relocated because of the risk of ceiling collapse. At the height of the blaze, there were 31 main jets in operation, consuming approximately 22,000 litres of water per minute. Fortunately, the castle has extensive water supplies, principally 49 internal hydrants fed from a 27 million litre reservoir, and 19 internal hydrants on an auxiliary main from the River Thames, capable of supplying over 5,500 litres per minute. In addition, there's a 100,000 litre swimming pool, an ornamental pond, an underground emergency water supply, and just outside the castle, the town's mains. For efficient command and control, the fireground was split into 4 sectors, with a senior officer in charge of each. Although the sectors were not geographically the same size, each sector commander did have roughly the same amount of personnel and equipment to look after, and their duties clearly included liaising with each other and with the fire incident commander at the main control unit. We'll come back later to sector commanders' other responsibilities, like arranging the feeding of personnel in their section. Right now, we want to return to the fire and highlight an area of clearly tremendous importance in this particular incident. Salvage. The fact that only one major item, a painting, was destroyed by the fire is a tribute to the salvage operation. Over 350 people took part. Police officers, soldiers, the RBFRS, firefighters, as well as members of the royal household standing alongside castle staff and tradesmen, in many cases passing artefacts from hand to hand in a human chain, linking the threatened areas inside the castle with the safety of the salvage sheets in the quad. Each work of art, each piece of furniture was listed in order of priority, room by room, so that the most valuable items would be saved first. From there, by lorry to storage areas outside the castle, all items recorded and logged as to their destination. Following a predetermined arrangement, the 25-strong castle salvage team coordinated the operation under the direction of the Royal Berkshire Fire and Rescue Service. By 3:30, the crews at last felt that they had surrounded the fire. The fire breaks at the Chester Tower and the Clock Tower had successfully prevented the blaze from spreading out of the northeast corner of the castle. The commitment of the crews, eager to contain the savage fire in these magnificent state apartments, was such as to occasionally exceed the normal number of entries into the building. Some wearers apparently went in 6 or 7 times in rapid succession on new cylinders. BA use was high. At times, 3 different brigades were using entry control boards at the same entry point, even though there were 4 entry points and BA main control was in operation. We're talking about 80 wearers being simultaneously deployed and using over 750 cylinders. Not surprisingly, during a fight that went on for such a long time, there were 2 evacuations.
HD from ACFO Harper. Persons reported collapse of building, 2BA missing. Over.
Evacuation was achieved, the personnel located, and the firefighting restarted in no more than 8 minutes. Eight minutes was again all it took for the second successful evacuation, this time after dark.
Attention, attention. All fire brigade personnel to report to the control unit.
By the time it got dark, the success of the fire breaks was obvious. But within the area surrounded, there was still further damage to be wreaked by the conflagration. The floors within the Brunswick Tower collapsed, and smoke and flames lit up the night sky as the tower was totally engulfed. By 8 p.m, the firemen had managed to bring that blaze under control. By 11 p.m, the announcement came that they had put out the main fire. Even so, pockets of fire continued to occupy their attention, and it wasn't until 2:30 a.m. that the fire was finally extinguished. In fire service terms, it had been a good stop. It wasn't an easy fire to handle because of the complexities of the building, but quick tactical decisions and many hours of really aggressive firefighting had contained the fire in the northeast wing, saving the castle from possible destruction. As it was, the devastation was heartbreaking enough. The throne room and the Waterloo chamber had been preserved, but 6 other rooms and 3 towers were destroyed or badly damaged. St George's Hall, the Grand Reception Room, the Brunswick Tower, the Prince of Wales Tower, the State Dining Room within it, the Crimson Drawing Room, the Green Drawing Room, the Chester Tower, and of course the private chapel where the fire originally started. A number of possible causes were examined and eventually discounted, before suggesting the probable cause to be a spotlight too close to the altar curtains. A reconstruction proved that over a period of time the heat from the lamp could well have ignited the curtain. The over-proximity was most likely brought about by a large 3-metre-high picture leaning against the altar curtain. Placed there while waiting to be viewed before packing, the top of the frame would most likely have pushed the curtain closer to the spot lamp than was concomitant with safety. Another possible reason could have been a movement of the spotlight fitted during the refurbishment process. Fire investigation was started while the fire was still raging. Fire investigation team experts observed the fire, noting how it spread, looking for unusual colour in the flames or smoke, and identifying the names of witnesses in the area when the fire started. One of the advantages of a joint team was access to a large pool of resources. Manpower and priority time was made available. Interviewing teams could take witnesses' statements, while plans and photographs were being studied and other evidence explored by scientists using forensic laboratory facilities. Over 100 people were interviewed, and it took the fire investigation team 8 days to complete their findings, under some pressure it must be said to reach a conclusion. The fire was also investigated by the Fire Research Station, independently of the Joint Brigade Police and Forensic Team. A good stop then, and one that left the service feeling good, knowing that it could handle an incident of national proportions. One of the things that people felt most positive about was that it had been approached and run as a team effort. In the rest of this video, we want to look at how the team operated, how they reacted to the challenges brought on by such a long fight against such a determined fire. We want to take a more detailed look at the incident under several headings, beginning with command and control. Any large fire at a major building needs clear lines of liaison between the various groups involved. At Windsor, that included the royal household. In Berkshire, emergency planning is also part of the fire brigade's remit, so an emergency planning officer was there working with the incident commander. Specialist designated officers played vital roles in the organisation. For example, a marshalling officer operating from a reporting point some distance away from the control unit made sure that appliances were parked in the most appropriate place while awaiting deployment. Not bringing all appliances into the quadrangle helped keep the working area clear. In the working area, the team effort was obvious, with people working together in a disciplined way. Care had to be taken to prevent crews accepting redirection from one task to another, from officers perhaps junior to the one who had deployed them in the first instance. It had been explained and fully understood that role, not rank, was a key factor in responding to the twists and turns of such a fierce blaze in such a complex situation. Of course, crucial to the success of that sort of approach is an assumption that communications are good between the various areas and levels of command. And it's clear that the sector commanders are used as they were at Windsor. The principal areas of their command responsibility need to be very well defined. These include, apart from the overall responsibility for the sector in their charge, communications and how the feeding of the personnel in their sector is to be achieved. Let's look at the vital area of communications first. Communications with the personnel in the sector, with main control, with BA control, and with the fire incident commander. Generally speaking, communications worked well. The Royal Berkshire Fireground radios have 8 channels, 2 specifically for inter-service use between police and fire services. For effective communications, the channels must be allocated centrally, and that allocation clearly distributed to key users and held at each radio set so that incident commander, sector commanders, specialist officers and so on can quickly and easily contact each other. In a large incident like this, the need to record the deployment of resources and tactical developments was recognised early on. In addition to the usual log, use was made of special incident loggers, individuals attached to the sector commanders and the fire incident commander, specifically to log information as it came in, and decisions as they were made. The work of these incident loggers certainly offered a more accurate debrief and evaluation of an incident that was active for more than 12 hours. However, it must be said that to perform even more efficiently, they do need to have better equipment. Still on the need for improved equipment, one possible problem for effective communication in a large fire is the high level of background noise. With straps or pockets, fireground radio speakers can get drowned. The use of earpieces would help officers monitor the radio more successfully. Another problem with noise level emerged with the need to evacuate. The whistles used were just not adequate for an incident of this size and complexity. People inside the buildings could not hear them. An incidental problem, byproduct of the scale and nature of the fire, was that non-fire service personnel didn't know that an evacuation of all occupants was required. It's obviously essential that all non-fire service personnel are briefed upon the standard evacuation signal and where to report on hearing it. From a visual point of view, communications in the fireground were greatly helped by the wearing of identification tabards by the various specialist officers. In fact, with hindsight, it would have been useful for key civilian personnel, like principal salvage officers, to have worn such identification tabards. Though not strictly to do with fireground communications, another incompatibility problem might be mentioned here. Due to the different cylinder charging pressures and connections, over-the-border brigades had to be supplied by their own BA support and cylinders. Since they had no facility for recharging, cylinders once used were out of action, an unnecessary curtailment of BA effectiveness. Within our own setup, while the joint operations of the control room and the major incident room proved how valuable the provision of an MIR can be, it became clear that there were occasionally communications problems using normal internal extensions. A dedicated link between the MIR and control room would clearly be advantageous. Something else worth considering is the provision of a small number of reserve lines for exclusive use of fire control. A swamping of HQ telephone lines, both by incoming calls and outgoing calls by other sections, like MIR, made it difficult at times for control to make the instant contacts it needed to make, for example with other brigades. The major incident room, manned by trained staff and members of the Berkshire Volunteer Force, remained in operation for 3 days, handling major instant recall, reliefs, general fireground requests, and of course press calls. During the actual fire, an emergency operations centre was opened at Shire Hall. It stayed in operation for 8 hours, helping in the main to satisfy the interests of the press. In this section, we want to look at the requirements imposed on the fire service by outside interest in such a major incident, especially one involving a high-profile building. In the case of VIPs, it seems best that either the fire incident commander or a well-briefed senior officer takes on the responsibility of meeting and escorting these important visitors. Liaison with many different agencies and other bodies is absolutely essential in a major incident like this. Equally essential is the appointment of one particular person as liaison officer, in charge of making and keeping contact with all these different groups. With an incident like the Windsor Castle fire, the media are naturally hungry for information and good dramatic stories. Clearly, access had to be restricted, especially with such a large number. And, in tactics agreed with the royal household, it wasn't until 2 p.m. that reporters and photographers were allowed into the quadrangle, albeit confined to the area of the dry moat. Even then, they still couldn't know what was going on inside the castle at the heart of the fire, so it was decided that the fire incident commander would give a press briefing every hour. With continuity in mind, another officer was always on hand listening to what the incident commander said, so that at any time 2 fire officers were clearly briefed as to what had been given to the media. Needless to say, the press briefing wasn't in their eyes just a matter of listening to a statement. It was a chance to ask questions. Since most fire service interviews are done on a one-to-one basis, the experience of facing 100 or so media people with video lighting and camera flash units is one that we thought the fire incident commander would like to share with you.
Responding to the media was probably one of my greatest personal and professional experiences, and followed my being unexpectedly asked to front the media coverage. There was a need to rapidly agree strategy, for instance, only the incident commander to undertake interviews, these to be of 10 to 15 minutes duration, operational commitments allowing, and with factual information only being proffered. I soon realised that it was impossible to follow my training, that is, to answer every question, and on a one-to-one basis. It needs to be realised that not everybody will have the benefits afforded to myself in being able to undertake their first interview jointly with a member of the royal family. This enabled me to witness the training and experiences of a person who is regularly in the public eye and stood myself and my colleagues in good stead for what was to come. I think that we were all aware that the media would go to great lengths to get a story, but on this occasion it even included patching into the senior officers' mobile phones and contacting officers' families at their homes. We soon learnt that these tactics were not to stop when the fire was extinguished, and for at least 6 months we continued to be pursued for a new angle on the story.
Quite clearly, the part of the building that has been involved in fire is very severely damaged, and you can quite clearly see that.
Just before we leave the issue of the media, it wasn't of course just the reporters at the castle who were looking for information. Press calls flooded into headquarters to be handled by staff at the major incident room and the emergency operations centre. Clearly there has to be great care in dealing with these calls, making sure that the message or information given out is correct and up to date, and matching what was said at the latest official briefing at the site of the fire. Sometimes it seemed that the press had more up-to-date information than the staff at HQ and Shire Hall had. Perhaps there was a need for an information officer at the scene, specifically to facilitate the flow of information back to those having to deal with press inquiries by phone. We turn now to some of the logistical problems involved in mobilising so many personnel and so much equipment from outside the area. The handling of such huge numbers of personnel and equipment was a new experience for us. If we look at the requirement for feeding, we're talking not just about the 225 fire service personnel, but a total, including other emergency services, castle staff and salvage helpers, of 700 people, a number beyond our normal pre-planning. There was no on-site facility. The castle's kitchen was right in the heart of the fire. A number of different methods were used to solve the problem. 400 cans of self-heat meals from the fire service supplies were quickly consumed, and support came from local fast food outlets in the town. And of course the feeding requirement didn't just cover the castle. There were standby crews from other brigades covering Berkshire fire stations too. There for a full shift, they needed hot food provision as well. There was a lot to learn from the incident in terms of provisions and feeding arrangements. While we already had an emergency planning officer to coordinate the voluntary support services, it's now felt that the use of a fire service feeding officer would have been invaluable. Such an officer could have coordinated the feeding arrangements of the many different agencies and created a more structured procedure for feeding, perhaps through the use of forward feeding stations or sector feeding areas. Clearly, better signposting was needed. It has to be said that time was wasted by crews and civilians trying to find the feeding stations. In an ideal situation, portable tables and chairs would have offered more pleasant conditions. But on the positive side, the warm air-heated inflatables brought in for feeding and recuperation purposes greatly reduced the cases of mild hypothermia that had occurred earlier. A final thought on the provision of food and refreshment. If the feeding stations were to be provided with handheld radios, then they could communicate with the sector commanders, or the coordinating feeding officer suggested earlier, advising them directly when food and space to eat it was available to their crews. As with feeding, changeover of crews on such a large scale hadn't been faced before. At the castle, coordinating a change of crews while active firefighting was still in progress proved extremely difficult. 1800, changeover time, and virtually doubling the numbers of personnel on the fireground or in the vicinity was an alarming prospect with the possibility of an evacuation ever at hand. The floors within the Brunswick Tower had already collapsed. Within half an hour it was going to be engulfed by flame. Over the border brigades were asked to make their own arrangements for changeover. We at Berkshire decided that the best way to get all our personnel, both whole-time and retained, changed over efficiently was to hire large coaches to drive around the fire stations picking up the fresh crews, bring them to the castle vicinity, then take the off-going crews back to their home bases. Undoubtedly another learning experience, and so too was the final area we want to cover, equipment recovery and return. Equipment used at the castle came from a variety of sources. Not only what was carried on the 36 pumping appliances and the 9 specials from 5 different counties, but also from fire brigade stores, from the police, the castle, the local authority and commercial hire companies. The problems arose, as you might have guessed, when the time came to return all this equipment to the right places. There's no doubt that it was the scale of the incident, this vast array of equipment, that pinpointed problems to be addressed, notably in the area of identification. Returning the equipment to the correct course took over 200 man-hours. It was first centralised in a local station and sorted into brigades. At the same time, a full inventory was drawn up by the officers in charge of all the appliances that had attended. A list of shortages and surpluses could then be collated so that the logistics of returning equipment could be planned. It had all been thought through, except that nobody was at that stage aware of how poorly the equipment was marked. Once the blaze had been brought under control, appliances were released and asked to take with them whatever equipment was most readily to hand. The idea was to clear the fire ground and take the equipment to the designated fire station. Once there did it emerge that, generally speaking, fire service equipment was not at all well marked. More problematic still, new equipment provided by brigade stores was new and had no marking at all. The same was true of some outside agencies' equipment. Perhaps it's superfluous to say that we strongly recommend all brigades to clearly mark their equipment so it can be identified, and that equipment from stores should be tagged or somehow temporarily labelled in case it has to be released in emergency. When all the equipment had been returned, over the border brigades collecting their own, then Berkshire sorting and returning theirs, there was an expected shortfall due to building collapse, an estimated loss of about £6,000 worth of equipment. Not a lot compared to the losses of Her Majesty the Queen and the nation generally. But there's little doubt that had the service not responded so quickly with the decision to contain the fire in the northeast corner, that far greater losses would have been suffered.
It was hardly an experience any of us would have wished for, such devastation of a national treasure. But to all of us who took part, it's something we shall never forget. We hope that we have been able to share with you some of that experience and what we've learned from it.